The three hikers thought they were taking a normal 2-hour trail, but when they finally came out of the forest, a park ranger told them something that made their blood run cold. Three friends once went on what should have been a simple 2-hour hike in a national forest in northern Oregon, but when they finally walked back out of the woods that night, the ranger waiting in the parking lot looked at them like he had just seen ghosts, because according to him, the trail they had just come from had been permanently closed for 7 years after 3 hikers vanished there without a trace. And the worst part was that the car sitting in the parking lot, the one Ryan swore he had parked there just hours earlier, looked like it had been abandoned for years, rust creeping across the doors and thick leaves piled around the tires, and the deeper they started thinking about the hike they had just taken, the more they realized something about that trail hadn't just been strange, it had been completely impossible. Because earlier that afternoon everything had looked normal when they arrived at the small gravel parking lot surrounded by towering pine trees, the kind of quiet place thousands of hikers visited every summer, and the wooden trail map near the entrance showed a simple loop that looked almost laughably easy, the kind of trail you could finish in 2 hours without even trying, and Ryan had actually joked while reading the sign that the biggest danger they'd probably face was boredom because the path looked so straightforward that getting lost seemed impossible. And for the first hour that joke almost felt accurate, the forest calm and peaceful as sunlight filtered through tall pine branches in long golden beams, their boots crunching softly over dry leaves while the narrow dirt trail wound gently between trees that seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky, and every few minutes they passed small wooden trail markers nailed to trees, simple signs with faded numbers and arrows pointing forward along the path. And nothing about the hike felt unusual until almost 2 hours later when Ryan suddenly slowed down near a fallen tree beside the trail, staring at it longer than the others expected, because something about it felt strangely familiar. The trunk split open with a jagged branch sticking out like a spear, and when he mentioned it the others laughed and said forests were full of trees that looked the same, but as they kept walking Ryan couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling that he had already passed that exact tree earlier in the hike. Not just one that looked similar but the exact same one, and 15 minutes later the feeling turned into something much worse when they reached another wooden trail marker nailed to a tree, a weathered sign with the number 18 carved into it, because one of them suddenly stopped walking entirely and said he was absolutely certain they had already passed that marker before, the same faded number, the same crooked nail, the same scratch running through the wood, and at first they assumed they must have accidentally looped around somewhere without noticing, but when they looked behind them, the trail looked exactly the same as the one ahead, a single narrow path stretching straight through endless rows of pine trees, and the longer they walked the quieter the forest became, until eventually the sounds of birds disappeared completely and the air felt strangely heavy, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, and by the time the sun began sinking toward the horizon they realized they had been walking for nearly 6 hours, far longer than the trail map said was possible. And that was when the pattern became impossible to ignore because they kept passing the same landmarks again and again, the same broken tree with the jagged branch, the same moss-covered rock beside the path, and worst of all the same trail marker carved with the number 18, and the most disturbing part was that none of them remembered turning around at any point. The trail had been completely straight the entire time. Yet somehow it kept bringing them back to the exact same place, and as the forest grew darker something even stranger began happening because the trail markers they were passing no longer looked the same as before, the wood darker and more weathered, the carved numbers fading like they had been exposed to years of rain and wind, and eventually they passed a marker that had completely fallen off the tree and was lying half buried in dirt and leaves like it had been abandoned there for a long time, and by then the forest didn't feel like the same place they had entered earlier that afternoon, the air colder and the shadows between the trees deeper and heavier, and when night finally settled in the realization hit them all at once that they had no idea where they were anymore, because the trail stretched endlessly in both directions into darkness, and every time they chose a direction it led them back to the same broken tree and the same number 18 marker waiting silently in the woods. Like something was forcing them to stay there, and eventually exhaustion forced them to sit beside the trail while they tried to figure out what to do, the silence around them so complete that even the smallest movement sounded unnaturally loud, and after nearly 20 minutes they decided their only option was to keep moving forward, hoping the path would eventually lead somewhere familiar, and strangely enough it did, because about an hour later the trees suddenly began thinning out and the ground flattened beneath their feet until they could see the faint outline of the gravel parking lot ahead through the darkness, and the relief they felt in that moment was overwhelming because it meant the nightmare of wandering through the endless forest was finally over. But the second they stepped out of the trees, something about the scene immediately felt wrong, because the parking lot looked older than it had earlier that day. The gravel darker and uneven with patches of grass growing through it as if no cars had driven across it in years. And when they looked toward Ryan's car, the uneasy feeling turned into something far worse, because the vehicle sitting in the same spot where they had parked earlier didn't look like the same car anymore. The paint faded and dull with rust spreading along the doors and wheel wells, while thick piles of dry leaves surrounded the tires like it hadn't moved in a very long time, and none of them spoke for several seconds because the realization was too strange to understand. But when Ryan slowly walked closer and shined his phone's flashlight across the windshield, the beam of light revealed something that made his stomach drop instantly. Dozens of faint scratches carved into the dusty glass like tally marks someone might use to count days. And before any of them could say a word, a voice suddenly echoed across the empty parking lot behind them, calm but confused, and when they turned around they saw a park ranger standing near the trail entrance staring at them like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. And as he walked closer he asked a question that made the entire situation even more disturbing, because he wanted to know how they had managed to get onto the trail at all when the entire area had been closed for years. And when they told him they had just followed the main path from the parking lot earlier that afternoon, the ranger slowly shook his head and pointed toward the forest behind them, explaining that the trail had been permanently shut down 7 years earlier after 3 hikers disappeared somewhere along the loop and were never found. And as the ranger finished speaking, Ryan slowly turned back toward the rusted car sitting silently in the lot, staring at the thick leaves around the tires and the scratched tally marks covering the windshield. And in that moment a terrifying thought began creeping into his mind, because if the ranger was telling the truth about the trail being closed for 7 years, then the question none of them were ready to answer was simple and horrifying at the same time. When they walked into that forest earlier that afternoon, exactly what year had they actually entered?